Cultural globalism is the spread of Enlightenment ideologies and liberal political discourse emphasizing self-determination and civil and political rights. Beginning in Serbia in 1999 and most recently in Kyrgyzstan in 2005, the post-communist world has witnessed a series of revolutions in which partly authoritarian post-communist regimes have been overthrown after mass protests. Known collectively as the Colored Revolutions, they have set many countries on a new path towards democratization. The events leading up to and during the Orange Revolution in Ukraine and the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan will be analyzed in terms of to what extent globalization was able to foster a successful social movement. Theories of political opportunity structure and resource mobilization capacity interlace to suggest under what circumstances and to what extent a social movement will succeed. Political opportunity structure suggests that a social movement is more likely to arise under a certain set of circumstances, including political conflict, high levels of repression, and deprivation of citizens' rights. In the cases of both Ukraine and Kyrgyzstan, fraudulent elections provided the opportunity for the development of a mass social movement. Resource mobilization capacity suggests that the success of a social movement is related directly to the amount of resources available. Most important in terms of mobilization capacity is the idea of power in numbers. Social movements with a sufficient number of participants, a resource, will continue to grow and put increasing pressure on the leadership to step down. Mobilization capacity also includes resources from abroad in the form of financial support. It is because of globalization that social movements are having a wide range of resources available. Upon the election of Leonid Kuchma in 1994, Ukraine began to regress into a state characterized by increasing corruption, deepened media censorship, decreasing press freedom, and a lack of any real economic growth. The 2004 presidential election marked the end of Kuchma's two-year term. Succeeding Kuchma was Viktor Yanukovych, who was running against opposing candidate Viktor Yushchenko. By association with Kuchma, public distrust for Yanukovych was already apparent. It was apparent that the public was already in favor of Yushchenko before the elections began. However, revolution was ignited in response to the government's supposed vote rigging and ballot fraud, suggesting the apparent victory of Yanukovych. A well-prepared movement put thousands of people into the streets of Kyiv, where they remained for 3 weeks until a revote was called. In the end, Yushchenko became the clear winner. In Kyrgyzstan, Askar Akiyev's term was characterized by a trajectory similar to Leonid Kuchma in Ukraine. Problems with corruption and ineffective governance caused public dissatisfaction with leadership. On the eve of parliamentary elections of 2005, Akiyev's unpopularity had grown even more considerably. Initial protests were started by supporters of oppositional candidates who mysteriously became unregistered on the day of elections. What began as anger towards a fraudulent election grew to include broader social and political issues. Massive oppositional protests took control of several government buildings and regions throughout Kyrgyzstan. Youth protesters successfully took over control of Akiyev's headquarters, forcing his resignation. Typically, American international NGOs have been viewed as prominent mechanisms through which foreign policy, interests, and regime change have been facilitated in many transitions from authoritarian rule. American interests include strategic expansion, energy security, and the war on terrorism. This suggests American engineering of revolutions. Looking at the sums involved, however, suggests that while financial support did come from the West, its role is often overestimated. Western funding for democracy assistance to Ukraine in 2004 was estimated to total $34 million US. Surprisingly, this is significantly less than the year before. In the year leading up to the Orange Revolution, Washington cut funding for democracy support in Ukraine as a reaction to the Kyrgyzstan murder and to revelations on recorded audio tapes on which President Kuchma approved the legal supply of high-tech radar systems to Saddam Hussein just before the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Although America decided to provide more support after the Orange Revolution, there was no increase in spending during the election year, suggesting that while Western support was not absent, it may not have been essential. The case of Western funding to Kyrgyzstan is similar. What little funding from the West went mostly to a small community of activists and opposition parties in Bishkek that were too remote from any real political action. Western media coverage suggests the United States' essential role in shaping the revolution, citing its funding of democracy-promoting programs. However, in actuality, international involvement was marginal and insignificant. Upon the election of Leonid Kuchma in 1994, the second president of independent Ukraine, the media found themselves again muzzled by severe constraints imposed by the state. During his decade-long administration, Kuchma became a notorious enemy of the press. Libel suits and offenses against journalists became normal. Well known as the murder of internet journalist Georgy Gangadze in 2000. The government's inability to solve the case aided to setting the stage for the Orange Revolution, as citizens demanded to know what happened to the prominent journalist. As a matter of fact, it was not until September of this year that a former high-ranking policeman confessed to strangling and beheading Gangadze on behalf of Leonid Kuchma. Kuchma is still under criminal investigation today and has been ordered not to leave Ukraine. Kuchma continued to abuse his influence over the media, and at this point in time, most mass media outlets were dominated by the political sphere. Media finally acknowledged its role in the transition to democracy in the time leading up to the Orange Revolution. The opposition skillfully used internet to recruit volunteers, organize campaigns, and gain sympathy from the global democratic community using what has been termed internet smart mobs. So much so that the Orange Revolution has been termed the world's first internet revolution. Using rating services that provide daily statistics on the activity and traffic of several pro-Yushchenko and pro-Yanukovych websites, Miroslav J. Kiev of Indiana University was able to document this phenomenon in the most comprehensive way, quantifying the impact of the internet on the events leading up to and during Ukraine's Orange Revolution. All of these sites followed the same general web strategy: organize opposition at home, search for volunteers, and solicit funds from abroad. Kij's data shows that the highest number of hits to these sites was recorded on November 22, 2004, the day of the second round of elections that was invalidated as fraudulent by the Supreme Court of Ukraine. Of these sites, a significant fraction were pro-Yushchenko. Pravda, a website formerly run by Gangadze, was alone able to reach an outstanding 30% of all internet users in the country on November 22nd. His study concludes that the internet was able to level the playing field in the Ukrainian election by successfully disseminating information the mass media could not. Further, the internet allowed for a network of support that transcended territorial borders, mobilizing an entire global community to participate in the revolution. Previous to the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan, a wave of uprisings against authoritarian regimes had already swept across the region. Kyrgyzstan's revolution in 2005 was very much inspired by the revolutions that had already taken place. It was globalization in the form of a breakdown of territorial boundaries, which allowed for the concept of regime change to infiltrate into Kyrgyzstan's borders. The Tulip Revolution has been described by some as a virtual revolution because it was staged by actors of the colored revolutions elsewhere, youth groups, internet sites, and Western-backed independent media. Therefore, Kyrgyzstan's revolution was very much an emulation of events that had already taken place in other countries. The revolution in Kyrgyzstan, however, was different from Ukraine in that massive protests were slower to materialize. This can be attributed to the form of localism that was not present in Ukraine. The engine of Ukraine's Orange Revolution were a large urban population, a strong civil society, strong oppositional parties, and a powerful youth movement. Kyrgyzstan, on the other hand, was mostly rural, and the opposition failed to establish parties, instead supporting local elites who lacked any broad support. While small, localized protests were happening everywhere, it was not until these isolated protests fused together that a national movement could be formed with enough strife to overthrow their government. In conclusion, both countries followed the same trajectory leading up to their revolutions. Fraudulent elections provided the ideal political opportunity structure to spark massive social movements. Resources then had to be mobilized. Ukraine's active independent media utilized the internet to stimulate rapid viral support for Viktor Yushchenko, effectively mobilizing massive protest movements and gaining support from the global community. Kyrgyzstan's Tulip Revolution was a result of the cascade effect of revolutions that were already sweeping across the region. In both cases, globalization allowed for each social movement to transcend its geographic borders, therefore becoming a mechanism for democratization.